Clara Whitmore had once known what it was to belong. Her father's house on Beacon Hill had been narrow but dignified, its windows always clean, its shelves heavy with books that smelled faintly of ink and dust. Her mother had taught her French before she was 10, music soon after, and insisted that education, true education, was the only inheritance that could never be stolen. In a city built on lineage and reputation, the Whitmores had never been wealthy enough to be careless, nor poor enough to be desperate. They lived instead by precision, by keeping accounts balanced, manners intact, and expectations measured. Then the fever came. First her mother, then her younger brother, then her father, already weakened by bad investments and worse partners. Within 18 months, Clara stood alone in a drawing room stripped bare by creditors, listening as men she had never met argued over what remained of her family's life. Loss did not arrive dramatically. It arrived through documents, whispered negotiations, and the quiet removal of objects that had once defined home. At 26, she was educated, composed, and entirely without protection. She worked where she could, copying letters, tutoring children who did not listen, keeping books for men who assumed she was incapable of understanding numbers. Again and again, she learned the same lesson. Intelligence in a woman was tolerated only when it remained invisible. Boston was not kind to women who had fallen without scandal. There was no pity for quiet ruin. By the winter of 1873, Clara understood one thing with painful clarity. If she stayed, she would disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, until even she could no longer remember the life she had intended to live. And so, when she heard of a small town far west, little more than a name, passed between teachers and clergy, barely settled, hungry for order, she sold the last of her mother's jewelry and bought a train ticket she did not yet know how to fear. Jonah Hale had once been certain of his future. At 32, he had owned a modest shipping interest along the Charles River and been engaged to a woman who spoke of love as though it were a contract, precise, public, and easily withdrawn. He had believed that steady effort would always be rewarded, that loyalty would be returned in kind, and that prudence could protect him from collapse. When the market collapsed, it did not take long for his partners to vanish. Nor did it take long for his fiancée to choose another man whose fortune had survived. Jonah did not beg. He did not rage. He simply watched as everything he had built dissolved into paperwork and silence. The worst of it was not the loss of money, but the sudden understanding that what he had believed solid had never been so. He learned in that season how thin certainty truly was. Boston became unbearable. Every street reminded him of a promise that had not been kept. Every polite nod carried the weight of quiet judgment. By the spring of 1873, he had sold what little remained and booked passage west, not with hope, but with resignation. If he was to fail again, he would do it under a wider sky. And so it was. Two strangers in the city, leaving their past behind and heading towards an unknown future. They met on a morning thick with fog. The train hissed like an impatient animal as passengers boarded, bundles clutched close, faces tight with anticipation or dread. Clara found her seat near the window, arranging her small case beneath her feet, her spine straight with habit. Jonah took the seat beside her without apology. To each of them, the other was simply another stranger in a carriage full of endings. Their first exchange was brief and unfavorable. "You're in my light," Clara said coolly, after several minutes of silence. Jonah glanced at her, surprised. The sun doesn't belong to either of us. It belongs to courtesy, she replied. That was enough to sour the journey's beginning. They spoke little at first, only sharp comments about space, noise, and the inconveniences of travel. But the train was long, and the land stretched endlessly westward. Silence eventually gave way to necessity. They learned reluctantly that they were bound for the same place, a town called Redfield Crossing, named less for anything grand than for the red dust that coated everything and the narrow river that crossed nearby. Not many people lived there, not yet. In the West, emptiness was not absence. It was invitation. That, oddly, was what drew them both. Somewhere past Chicago, the train slowed during the night, its rhythm changing just enough to wake those who had been half asleep. Lamps flickered overhead, casting uneven light across tired faces. Wind pressed against the windows as though testing the carriage. Clara sat awake, reading by dim light, her notebook open beside her. She had learned long ago that sleep came easier when her mind was occupied. Jonah noticed the neatness of her handwriting, the careful margins, the way she paused between lines. "You're educated," he said quietly, not as an observation meant to flatter, but as one meant to understand. She looked up. "I am. That'll matter out there. Only if I survive," she answered. There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. Jonah found himself nodding before he realized he had done so. Survival was a language he understood now, stripped of illusion. Conversation softened after that. Not all at once. It loosened gradually, like a knot worked free with patience rather than force. They spoke first of what had failed, not what they hoped for. Loss came more easily than ambition. Clara spoke of family without sentimentality, as though sentiment had already been spent. Jonah spoke of business in the same way, precise and unsparing. They did not interrupt each other. Neither tried to repair what could not be repaired. In that restraint, something like trust began to form. Later, as the train crossed into open plains, they spoke of fear, not of danger, but of insignificance, of reaching the end of one's life without having tested its shape. Jonah spoke of wanting to build something that could not be taken without effort. Clara spoke of wanting to be useful in a way that mattered. It surprised both of them how easily these thoughts were spoken aloud. The pact they made did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary. They would help one another where they could. They would share information, watch for danger, speak honestly. Nothing sentimental, nothing promised, just survival. They arrived at Redfield Crossing at night. The town revealed itself slowly, as though reluctant to be known. Wooden buildings gathered close against the dark, a saloon glowing with rough laughter, a general store already shuttered, and a small white church standing slightly apart, its door ajar. Places like this did not advertise themselves. They waited to see who would stay. Clara felt the dust immediately, fine, persistent, settling into hems and hair, as though claiming ownership. Jonah noticed the quiet. It was not peaceful, exactly. It was expectant. Father Amos Caldwell greeted them without questions. "You're not the first," he said gently, "and you won't be the last." They slept on pews that night, coats folded beneath their heads. The church creaked softly as wind moved through it. Clara slept without dreaming. Jonah lay awake longer, listening to her breathing in the dark, surprised by the comfort of another presence. Morning brought dust and light in equal measure. The town looked different by day, smaller, more exposed. Clara noticed how people moved with purpose, how little was wasted in gesture or speech. Jonah noticed how everything bore signs of repair. Father Caldwell listened carefully as they explained their skills. He asked questions. He waited for answers. "We need help at the schoolhouse," he said to Clara. "Miss Larkin is capable, but stretched thin. And Mr. Rawlins at the Barrow Ranch could use a man who understands numbers as well as horses," he added, turning to Jonah. By dusk, both had work. They parted reluctantly, she to a boarding house with strict rules and thin walls, he to the ranch where space was abundant, but comfort was not. Neither expected the separation to feel like loss. But it did. They did not meet by accident again. Jonah came into town when he could. Clara began to linger after school, walking instead of returning immediately to the boarding house. Sometimes they met on the main road, exchanging news, small things at first, wages, supplies, the weather. Other times, they walked beyond town, toward the low hills, where the land opened wide and conversation felt easier. Those walks became a kind of ritual. They spoke of plans tentatively, as though testing whether the words would hold. They spoke of fear more freely now, of how easy it would be to fail here, of how much effort survival required when there was no one to absorb mistakes. Clara noticed how Jonah listened, not waiting to speak, not correcting. Jonah noticed how Clara thought aloud, tracing consequences before decisions were made. Once, while crossing uneven ground, Jonah reached out instinctively and steadied her by the elbow. The touch lingered, a moment too long. Neither mentioned it. That silence became familiar, even comfortable, a place where want existed without demand. They began to understand something quietly, carefully. Together, they were stronger, not because they needed one another, but because they sharpened one another. They spoke of it plainly one evening, seated on a rise overlooking Redfield Crossing, the town small beneath them. "We work well together," Jonah said. "We do," Clara agreed. "For now," he added, "it should stay practical." She nodded. Yes, practical. Both felt relief at the boundary, and something like regret. They chose partnership, nothing more. After that evening, something settled between them. Not certainty, understanding. They did not rush, neither trusted speed. Instead, they allowed repetition to do its work. They walked often, sometimes through town, nodding to faces that were becoming familiar, sometimes beyond it, where the land stretched wide and silence invited honesty. Clara spoke of structure, of how children learned best when expectations were clear. Jonah listened, remembering details she did not realize she was revealing. Jonah spoke of risk, how knowing when not to act mattered as much as action itself. Clara listened with the same attentiveness. Each began to recognize the rare comfort of being met, not managed. They noticed small things. The way Jonah adjusted his pace so she wouldn't have to hurry. The way Clara remembered figures he mentioned once, weeks earlier. The way silence between them felt companionable rather than strained. Desire hovered at the edges of awareness. Clara felt it when Jonah stood too close while explaining a plan, his voice low, his presence grounding. She felt it in the brief warmth of his hand when he passed her a ledger. Jonah felt it when Clara laughed unexpectedly, when her concentration softened into quiet confidence. Neither allowed it to surface. They had both learned how easily attachment could become loss. The idea of land did not arrive fully formed. It surfaced in fragments, in passing remarks about others who came and left, in questions left unanswered. "Have you noticed," Clara said one afternoon, "how many people come here intending to stay, but never quite do?" "They work for others," Jonah replied. "Save little. Leave when it becomes too hard." "What if," she continued, careful, "we didn't?" The question lingered. They sat in silence, the wind moving through dry grass. "We would need capital," Jonah said eventually, "and patience." "We have both," she replied. Jonah realized then that this was not hope speaking, but assessment. They spoke late into the evening, of the Homestead Act, of labor, of weather, of what it would mean to be responsible not just for survival, but for creation. By the time they parted, the decision had already been made, not impulsively, but deliberately. They walked the land several times before committing to it. Not because they were uncertain, but because certainty, they had learned, was something that improved under scrutiny. The land lay several miles from town, open and uneven, its surface broken by low scrub and patches of dark soil where water lingered after rain. There were no trees to speak of, no shelter beyond what they would build themselves. It was not kind land, but it was honest. They spoke little as they walked, each absorbed in quiet calculation. Clara measured distance and slope, imagining structures not yet present, where a house might stand, where a garden could be coaxed from the soil. Jonah watched how water moved, where wind cut hardest, where fences would need reinforcement. Once, Jonah stopped and turned slowly in place, surveying the horizon. "This will test us," he said. "Yes," Clara replied, "but it won't surprise us." That distinction mattered. When they filed the claim under the Homestead Act, the process itself was unremarkable. Names signed, papers folded, instructions given in a tone that suggested both encouragement and warning. Land was not granted here. It was endured into ownership. They stood together afterward, the paper secure in Jonah's coat, the land stretching ahead of them. Neither reached for the other, but neither stepped away. They began with the house, not because it was ambitious, but because it was necessary. The first structure was small, intentionally so. One main room, thick walls, a roof pitched sharply enough to shed snow. Clara insisted on proper measurements. Jonah insisted on materials that could withstand weather rather than impress neighbors. They worked in rhythm. Jonah handled procurement, bargaining for timber and tools, calculating costs down to the smallest margin. Clara kept the accounts, recalculating nightly, adjusting plans when numbers tightened. Neither questioned the other's authority. That, too, was deliberate. Days passed in labor and dust. Their conversations shifted from speculation to logistics, from possibility to execution. Once, as Jonah struggled to set a beam alone, Clara stepped forward without a word, bracing it with her shoulder, her hands steady despite the strain. He looked at her, surprised. "I had it," he said. "I know," she replied, "but you didn't have to." They shared a look that lingered longer than necessary. Then the beam was set, and the moment passed. That summer, Clara continued to teach. Each morning, she rode into town. The rhythm of her days divided between the schoolhouse and the land that waited for her return. Her wages were modest but predictable, a small, steady counterweight to the uncertainty of their endeavor. Jonah noticed the difference her income made, not only in numbers, but in confidence. It allowed them to choose quality over haste, to repair rather than replace, to wait when waiting was wiser. Clara, for her part, took quiet satisfaction in this, knowing that her work sustained more than lessons. In the evenings, she returned to the homestead tired but alert, eager to see what had changed in her absence. Jonah often met her at the edge of the property, updating her as they walked together. Once, without thinking, he took the reins from her and steadied her dismount. His hand remained at her waist for a fraction of a second too long. Neither acknowledged it, but both felt the echo of it long after. By midsummer, the homestead had acquired a rhythm. Mornings began early. Work paused at midday heat. Evenings stretched longer, softened by shared meals and quiet conversation. They ate together whenever possible, sometimes at a rough table inside, sometimes sitting outside as the light faded. Clara read aloud when her voice was not too tired. Jonah listened, his hands busy, his attention fixed. Occasionally their knees brushed beneath the table. Once, reaching for the same cup, their fingers touched fully. Neither withdrew immediately. Clara felt her breath change. Jonah felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. They let go slowly. Desire existed now, not as surprise, but as presence, acknowledged, unnamed, carefully contained. The idea of cattle emerged gradually, as most sensible decisions did. They discussed it first as possibility, then as plan. "Not many," Clara said one evening, ledger open between them, "just enough to begin." Jonah studied the figures. "We'll need feed through winter." "My wages will cover it," she replied without hesitation. "If we're careful." He looked at her then. Truly looked. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I'm not," she answered. The purchase was modest, but sound. Healthy stock, manageable numbers. When the cattle arrived, the work increased immediately. Fences needed reinforcement. Shelter required adjustment. Jonah took to it naturally. Clara learned quickly, asking questions, observing closely. They stood together often, watching the animals settle. "It feels different now," Jonah said once. "Yes," Clara replied. "It does." Neither specified what different meant. By late summer, the land no longer felt provisional. Structures stood firm. Fields were marked. The barn smelled of hay and effort. They began speaking less of if and more of when. Autumn arrived gently at first. Cooler mornings, longer shadows. With it came a subtle tightening of focus. They prepared deliberately. Wood stacked, fences checked, roof inspected twice. Everyone in Redfield Crossing spoke of winter with the same tone. Measured, respectful, and never lightly. One evening, standing together, beneath a sky already sharpened by cold, Jonah spoke quietly. "Whatever happens," he said, "I don't regret this." Clara nodded, her voice steady. "Neither do I." They stood close, shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the land they had claimed not with optimism, but with effort. Snow had not yet fallen, but it was coming. The first snow did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically. Thin flakes drifting down in the early morning, dissolving on contact with the ground. Clara noticed it first from the doorway, her breath catching not in fear, but recognition. "So it begins," she said. Jonah stepped beside her, pulling his coat closer. "That's not winter yet." "No," she agreed, "just its introduction." They moved differently after that. Not hurried, but precise. Tasks were completed earlier in the day. Tools were checked twice before being put away. Conversations turned increasingly toward contingencies. What could fail, what must not. Winter, they understood, was not dramatic. It was relentless. As the days shortened, the world narrowed. Clara still rode into town for school, though less frequently now. When weather threatened, she stayed, and the children stayed home too. Her absence from the schoolhouse was noticed, quietly accepted. Jonah rose before dawn regardless. She often woke to the sound of the door closing softly behind him, careful not to disturb her. Sometimes she lay awake afterward, listening to the wind, counting the time until his return. She did not name the tension that accompanied those hours, but she felt it. In the evenings, when he came back in from the cold, she took his coat without thinking, hung it near the fire, set water to warm. These gestures were not discussed. They did not need to be. Winter drew them inward. The house, once sufficient, now felt small, but not uncomfortably so. Rather, it required awareness. They learned each other's movements intimately. Jonah knew when Clara needed quiet and when she needed distraction. Clara knew when Jonah required solitude and when he lingered simply to remain near her. Once, as Jonah came in with snow clinging to his boots, he slipped slightly on the threshold. Clara reached out instinctively, catching his arm. He steadied himself, but her hand remained there. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, her hand warm against his sleeve. They did not step apart immediately. In winter, closeness became practical. It was no longer something to avoid. They spoke less now, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had acquired weight. It was in the quiet moments that Clara's thoughts grew restless. She found herself revisiting old fears, of dependence, of loss, of building something only to watch it dissolve. She wondered sometimes whether she had mistaken partnership for safety. And yet, when she imagined the days without Jonah's presence, the thought hollowed her. Jonah carried his own unease. He worried about the cattle constantly, about supplies, about the thin margin between effort and disaster. But beneath those practical concerns lay something deeper. He had learned what it meant to lose what one assumed secure. And now, for the first time since Boston, he had something worth guarding. The first true storm arrived in December. Snow fell heavily through the night, wind pressing hard against the house, finding every weakness. They sat together near the fire, listening to the sound of it, the creak of wood, the hiss of snow against walls. Clara read aloud until her voice tired, then leaned back against the wall, her shoulder brushing Jonah's. He shifted slightly, not away, but closer. They did not speak. When the storm passed, they rose together and went out to inspect the damage. Fences held. The cattle were shaken, but intact. They exchanged a glance, brief, relieved. It felt like a small victory. By mid-December, winter established itself fully. Days followed a strict pattern. Morning checks, careful movement, minimal waste, evenings near the fire, shared meals, occasional laughter, subdued but genuine. Clara took to mending and planning. Jonah kept ledgers now too, comparing notes with her, double-checking figures. Sometimes, as they worked side by side, their hands brushed over the same page. Once, Jonah reached for a cup and found Clara's fingers already there. He did not pull away. She did not either. They had crossed into a kind of intimacy that required no explanation. As January approached, a quiet tension settled over everything. They both felt it. The storms grew heavier, the wind sharper. Jonah checked the cattle more frequently. Clara watched him leave each morning with increasing unease. Neither spoke of what they feared. They did not need to. Winter had taught them patience, but it had not yet taught them mercy. January arrived without ceremony. The days shortened further, light thinning until it felt more like suggestion than presence. Snow no longer melted between storms, it layered itself, compacted by wind and cold, reshaping the land into something unfamiliar. The cattle grew restless. Jonah noticed it first, the way they shifted constantly, the way they pressed against the fences when the wind changed direction. He checked the lines more often now, walking their length, even when the cold cut deep. Clara watched him from the doorway more than once, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her breath tight in her chest. "You're watching them like they're about to leave," she said one evening. Jonah did not smile. "They're nervous." "So are you," she replied quietly. He met her gaze then, surprised not by the observation, but by the accuracy of it. The storm warnings were not formal. There were no bulletins, no schedules, only signs. The wind shifted, sharp and erratic. The sky took on a flat, metallic color that made distance difficult to judge. Birds vanished. Even sound seemed muted, swallowed by the cold. Clara felt it in her body, a restlessness she could not settle. She moved through the house repeatedly, checking supplies that had already been checked. Jonah sharpened tools he had no immediate need for, his movements precise, controlled. That night, sleep came lightly, if at all. They lay in separate beds, aware of one another's presence, through thin walls, listening to the wind press against the house, as though testing its resolve. Clara counted the gusts, the pauses between them. Jonah lay awake thinking of fences. The storm arrived before dawn. Jonah knew it the moment he woke, the sound of it heavier than before, the way the house creaked in response. Snow drove sideways past the windows, visibility reduced to little more than a suggestion of movement. He pulled on his boots quietly, but Clara was already awake. She sat up as he reached for his coat. "It's worse than last night," she said. He nodded. "The fence near the eastern slope won't hold this." "You don't know that," she replied, though they both knew he did. He hesitated, his hand still on the coat. Clara swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cold biting immediately. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that she could feel the heat he still carried from sleep. "Say it," she said. "If the cattle break through," Jonah said carefully, "we'll lose them, and we won't get another chance this season." The words were measured, practical. They were also final. Clara closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "Then wait until it eases," she said. Jonah shook his head. "It won't." They stood there, the wind roaring outside, the space between them charged with everything they had not yet spoken. For the first time, Clara felt the sharp edge of fear, not abstract, not distant, but immediate and personal. "This isn't about the cattle," she said quietly. Jonah looked at her. "It is," he replied, "but it's also about everything after." She understood then what he meant. If they lost the cattle, they would not just lose income, they would lose momentum, credibility. the fragile balance they had built with such care. Still, the thought of him stepping into that storm tightened something in her chest. "I don't want you to go," she said. The admission surprised them both. Jonah's expression softened, not with relief, but with something like recognition. "I know," he said. For a moment, he did not move. Then Clara reached for the scarf hanging by the door and pressed it into his hands. "Come back," she said. He nodded once. That was all. The door closed behind Jonah with a sound that felt louder than it should have. Clara stood where he had left her, listening as his footsteps faded almost immediately beneath the wind. Snow drove hard against the house, erasing any sign of him within seconds. She moved only when she had to. She stoked the fire higher than usual. She set blankets near it. She boiled water and left it ready, as though preparation might summon him back. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes lost shape. She sat, then stood, then sat again, her attention fixed on the door. With each passing moment, the storm grew louder. She imagined him fighting the wind, snow blinding him, hands numb as he worked the fence. She imagined him slipping, rising, pressing on regardless. And with that image came another, unbidden and devastating. The possibility that he might not return. The realization struck her with clarity that left no room for denial. What bound her to Jonah was no longer partnership. It was attachment, full, unguarded, and terrifying in its depth. She pressed her hands together to still their shaking. "Come back," she whispered again, though no one could hear her. Jonah came back near dawn, not walking, stumbling. Clara heard the sound before she saw him, the scrape against the door, the dull thud as something heavy struck the frame. She was on her feet instantly, wrenching the door open against the wind. He collapsed forward. She caught him with a cry she did not recognize as her own. His coat was soaked through, stiff with ice. Blood darkened one sleeve. His face was ashen beneath the frost. "Jonah," she said, dragging him inside with a strength born of desperation. "Jonah, stay with me." He did not answer. She pulled the door shut behind them, the storm raging on, indifferent. Jonah lay motionless on the floor. Clara knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his, her breath coming fast and uneven. "No," she said softly, fiercely. "You don't get to leave now." She stripped his wet clothing away with shaking hands, replaced it with dry blankets, pressed warmth back into limbs that barely responded. She spoke to him constantly, nonsense, promises, fragments of memory, anything to keep sound in the room. At one point, his hand twitched, weakly. She seized it immediately, pressing it between both of hers. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." His fingers tightened slightly. It was enough. The night did not pass. It stretched. Clara lost any sense of hours almost immediately. Time became measured instead in breaths, in the rise and fall of Jonah's chest, in the faint warmth she worked to restore to his hands. She dragged a chair close to the bed and sat with him, her coat still on, her hair loose from its pins. The fire burned steadily now, fed with care rather than panic. She pressed warm cloths to his skin. She spoke to him in a low voice, not because she expected answers, but because silence felt dangerous. "I need you to stay," she said once quietly, as though the words might slip away if spoken too loudly. "Just stay." Jonah did not wake, but his breathing steadied. That small mercy carried her through the darkest hours. When exhaustion finally pulled her head forward, she startled awake instantly, her hand tightening around his. She did not let herself sleep deeply. She did not trust the night to leave him untouched. By dawn, her body ached with strain, but she did not notice. All that mattered was that he was still there. Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness for days. Sometimes he knew Clara was there before he opened his eyes. Sometimes he felt her hand first. Cool now, steady, unmistakable. He heard her voice more often than he saw her face. She spoke to him as she worked, narrating small, ordinary things. The weather, the fire, the cattle. It anchored him, gave him something familiar to hold to when pain threatened to pull him under. Once, when fever took him hard, he murmured her name without knowing he had done so. Clara froze. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "I'm here," she said, careful to keep her voice calm. "I'm right here." His breathing eased after that. She did not move away. Recovery came slowly. There was no sudden turning point, no dramatic awakening. Just incremental change. Jonah slept longer. He took broth without choking. His color returned. Faintly at first, then with more conviction. Clara watched for every sign. She learned the shape of his weakness, the rhythm of his healing. She adjusted her movements around him instinctively, quiet when he slept, present when he woke. When he finally opened his eyes fully and held them open, she exhaled shakily, only then realizing how tightly she had been holding herself together. "You look terrible," he said hoarsely. She laughed once, abruptly, the sound breaking free before she could stop it. "So do you," she replied. He reached for her hand, without thinking. She let him take it. When Jonah was strong enough to sit, the world seemed to shift. Not outwardly, but between them. They spoke little of the storm itself. The facts were known. The cattle had been saved, the fence repaired, the cost paid. What lingered was everything else. He felt changed too, not weakened, clarified. He understood now that what he feared losing was not the work or even the land. It was her. They did not speak of love. They did not need to. It showed itself in 100 small ways. In how Clara set his tools closer now, anticipating his reach. In how Jonah waited for her before beginning work again. In how silence between them felt no longer like restraint, but recognition. One evening, as the fire burned low, Jonah spoke quietly. "I didn't think I'd come back." Clara did not look away. "I know. I don't want to do that to you again." She reached out then, deliberately this time, and placed her hand over his. "Then don't," she said. Their fingers intertwined naturally. They sat like that for a long while, neither needing to say more. When Jonah was well enough to resume light work, Clara insisted on accompanying him, not to supervise, to stand beside him. They moved slowly across the land together, the snow beginning to recede in places, the first hints of thaw visible in darkened soil. "This place nearly took you from me," she said once quietly. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "And it kept me," he replied, "because you did." She looked at him then, truly looked. "What we have," she said slowly, "it's already more than partnership." He nodded. "I know." They stood close, the cold no longer biting quite so hard. This was not a leap. It was a step they had already been walking toward for months. When Jonah was well enough to resume light work, Clara insisted on accompanying him, not to supervise, to stand beside him. They moved slowly across the land together, the snow beginning to recede in places, the first hints of thaw visible in darkened soil. "This place nearly took you from me," she said once quietly. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "And it kept me," he replied. "Because you did." She looked at him then, truly looked. "What we have," she said slowly, "it's already more than partnership." He nodded. "I know." They stood close, the cold no longer biting quite so hard. This was not a leap. It was a step they had already been walking toward for months. They married in spring. Quietly, the church was filled with familiar faces. Father Caldwell's voice carried warmth rather than ceremony. Clara wore a simple dress. Jonah stood steady beside her. There was no hesitation when they spoke their vows. They had already tested them. Years later, when people spoke of Clara and Jonah, they did not speak of romance. They spoke of steadiness, of a home that endured storms, of land that was worked, not conquered, of two people who arrived with little more than resolve and stayed. At night, when the stars burned clear and the dust settled softly around them, Clara would rest her head against Jonah's shoulder. And Jonah, feeling the solid truth of her there, would think, not for the first time, that survival, when shared, could become something like grace.